but I was thinking about this concept that if you can open people up emotionally and cognitively to potential opportunities, then they begin to see the positive. And you were saying basically that there's a negative and the positive. And I was thinking of it in the sense that most of the work that's been done on change, essentially, with the reason a lot of people are resistant to change is, in a sense, some sort of fear of difference or whatever it may be. And so what you're describing is to move away from the fear and move to an openness, a receptiveness. And if you can do that, then change becomes so much more possible. Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, I have the privilege of having renowned leadership expert Dr. Richard Boyatzis on the podcast to discuss the science of change and what that means for effective leadership. Dr. Boyatzis earned his bachelor's degree in aeronautics and astronautics at MIT, then his master's and PhD in social psychology from Harvard. He's currently a distinguished university professor at Case Western Reserve. He's an international authority on emotional intelligence, leadership, and change. His groundbreaking work in intentional change theory has shaped how we think about guiding others through change. He's won numerous awards and has published multiple New York Times best-selling books on leadership and is soon to publish his new book, The Science of Change. Dr. Boyatzis, thank you for joining me today on The Science of Leadership.
Thank you, Tom.
All right, Dr. Boyatzis, let's jump right in. You've spent decades studying leadership and change. Before we dive into the science behind it, I'd love for you to share your perspective on what initially sparked your interest in this field. Why do you focus on leadership and change specifically?
I was always very curious, even as a little kid. I remember I must have been about 7 when I took the toaster apart and my mother walked back into the kitchen and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I wanted to figure out how it worked." Unfortunately, my history is I didn't always put things back together completely. But if I jump ahead, my parents were immigrants from Greece. My father was a waiter. They couldn't really help me out when I did get into MIT and the program I wanted to be in, which was really, I specialized in control systems of interplanetary vehicles. But MIT got me in my junior year a job doing that work. So I was working for the Experimental Gas Dynamics Research Unit at Northrop NORAIR in LA. And if you did that 5.5 month span at that, full salary level, you usually could save enough to finish, which is exactly what happened. And, we seemed to do pretty well because they offered myself and 2 of my fraternity brothers were out there in other units jobs after we graduated. What became very clear was I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life because we couldn't, in 1966, we couldn't go into space because I had to wear glasses.
Mm.
And so it was basically, from somewhere between 7:30 and 8 a.m. till 4:30 or 5 every day, sitting at a cubicle programming computers. And then once every month or 2, you go out to Edwards Air Force Base and watch some other people have the fun of, piloting these experimental vehicles. So I went back to MIT and I said, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. Every male I knew, my father, all my uncles, my cousins, every male, they were all Greek, in New York City was in the restaurant business. I'd done it a few summers. I didn't want to do that. As I mentioned to you before, I was playing a lot of music. We did 70, 80 paying jobs. But I didn't think I was quite good enough to really make a living at it. Mm-hmm. So I said, maybe I'll go into management. It's got to be easy. Look at these jerks we had out at Northrop. And there were 2 research units at Northrop, and both of them were filled with Sheldons.
Yeah.
Everybody was either really smart or scary smart, but we were all universally weird. Social. Well, there was one guy who was normal, but everybody else was socially immature and odd, including the managers. And that's what I learned was how managers didn't help their subordinates. I couldn't believe how little these two managers of these departments got out of such talent.
Yeah.
So um, I go to sign up for some courses in management at MIT, and one of the professors, and they had a thing where if they didn't have prerequisites, they would give in this one big session, with hundreds of people showing up, a description of, in this case, it was about 8 courses, I think, 7 or 8 courses. And this one young guy who was finishing a PhD at Harvard in psychology described a course on organizational psychology that to me sounded like utter crap. But in the description, he described 2 things about his course that made me run to the basement classroom to get in. No tests. Turns out I've always been test phobic my whole life, even though I end up doing well. But I'm a nervous wreck, and
Mhm.
in that class, I offered to do. I wanted to do my term paper on how managers don't help their subordinates. And he said, we have some real data on how our MBAs, 28 to 30-year-olds, are helping each other or not. Would you rather use real data? I said, yes, of course I would. I worked on it all semester. He liked what I did. He offered me a summer job. We eventually published that paper. But it was in the spring of 1967 that I began working in the field of psychology on this theory of how people change. And I got enthralled. I found a field that I loved. I didn't know anybody that loved their work so much they'd do it whether they got paid or not. That
Yeah.
just wasn't the social class I was in
Sure.
or grew up in. I
Yeah.
now found it.
Yeah.
And what became clear was that I was fascinated by not just how do individuals change, but how do couples or dyads change? Boss, subordinate,
Hmm.
spouses, siblings. How do teams change? How do organizations change? How do communities change? And eventually, how do countries change? So that was the beginning of my theory. And I was started out doing this competency research. I'm very often seen as one of the 5 people who started the competency movement in HR. And at the same time, I was doing some, just to earn my way through, doing some organizational leadership consulting. Monsanto, American Baptist, Home Mission
Hmm.
Societies, and a variety of those kind of places. Later, Mattel. And I mean, I started coaching executives in 1969.
Ahead of the
It,
curve for
it,
sure.
yeah, talk about arrogance. But at any rate, I was using my skills as a therapist, as a nation therapist, and
Hmm.
so it wasn't that hard to be able to figure out the translation. But what became clear during the 70s is that when I would dabble with organizational change, it was clear most of the time, most of the effort that went into leadership training, management training was a waste of time. And that still holds today. I mean, if you looked at the actual research on management and leadership training in industry and government, or you looked at the impact of MBA programs and management programs, it's abysmal compared to the amount that's spent on it. The AMA, American Management Association, came along and they said, we want to develop a master's program that could actually, instead of an MBA, actually teach people to manage and lead.
Hmm.
So they picked us to help them with, because we had this body of research. I reanalyzed a lot of the data that came out as my 1982 research book, which was the first ever compilation of data on competencies predicting actual performance. And that set me off on the path. What I study is sustained desired change. So I'm not going to focus on when things go bad, because there's plenty of
Hmm.
people that will look at that. I'm going to focus on what happens when you want to change in a certain way, again, individually or organizationally or teams or communities, and what of it is sustained. Because
Hmm.
a lot of people cope. New Year's Eve's resolutions, you go to the health club for a few weeks and then you stop. So the issue is if it's individual, are you sustaining it 12 to 24 months? If it's organizational, are you sustaining it 3 or 4 years later? If it's a team, is it holding 18 months later? So that's been my pursuit. And uh, we started focusing a lot more on the leadership aspects of it, if for no other reason than the practical reason that a lot of people wanted to pay for it. So there was money for the research as
Sure.
well as the attempt to improve it, the change programs. And we started showing at Weatherhead at Case Western Reserve that with this additional course that we had designed based on my intentional change theory, that we were showing 68% improvement on emotional and social intelligence competencies, behaviors
Mm-hmm.
of people in leadership and executive positions. And it was holding out. I mean, there's an asymptotic reduction, but it was holding out at a 50% improvement 7 years later. When the best training programs in industry or government were showing an 11% increase and then down to about 0 3 months later, MBA programs above average ones were showing a 2% increase and drifting down to zero after that. So I finally hit a point where we'd been doing a lot of the research. We had a lot of longitudinal studies published. Uh, I had done a lot of hormonal work in the alcohol research days in the 70s, but I shifted to the neuroimaging work in the early aughts and started a series of fMRI studies, which and a few of the doctoral students I was supervising did the hormonal studies, and we really nailed a number of things about the change process. And as I did that, in 2000, I co-taught a course on complexity theory in the graduate school, engineering school at Case, with a geneticist, a mathematician, and a systems specialist, a fellow, Mike Basarevich, professor, who's in Club of Rome. And it was very clear to me as I was teaching my classes and interacting with them around their section of the course and all the students that it was time for me to make sure that my theory embraced the multi-levelness that it had in it. I mean, because I've been
Mm-hmm.
working on that for a long time. And that's when it became very clear to me that my intentional change theory wasn't what's called isomorphic. It wasn't similar at these different levels. It was actually a fractal. It was the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that leads you to a number of things. You have to understand with complexity theory tipping points. What's the state that moves you into this other next part of the change process? Um, what's the thing that activates emotional contagion positively so you're moving toward something rather than negatively where you're in a defensive posture? And eventually, we've published a lot of pieces, even at the individual level. How do you deal with stress? Um, so for example, medicine has shown that lowering your stress doesn't help a lot. I mean, it may help somewhat, but you're still impaired. You're just impaired at a milder level. The only real antidote to stress is we call renewal, but it's the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. And the research had been building, although a lot of people didn't pay attention to that. I kept saying, well, how do we lower stress? Well,
Mm-hmm.
the issue was not that. How do you have these other moments? And that was the heart of the tipping point. And when I added the activation of the specific neural networks in the brain, it became very clear to me that things I had thought in the early 70s about change, like the importance of goal setting, were absolutely wrong. That in fact, goal setting early in a change process inhibits change or learning. And that's when we got to one of the distinctive features of my theory. It had been all along, but now I kind of nailed the mechanism, neurological mechanism, is that when you talk to somebody about their dreams, about their vision, about their sense of
Mm-hmm.
purpose, they literally open up inside. Their brain and their body is open to new ideas and learning. And when you talk about a specific goal or a problem, it goes the other way. It's what I call a
Mm-hmm.
negative emotional attractor. You
Yeah.
focus, which is useful later in the process of change. But in the whole first half or first two thirds of a change process, you're stunted. you're just still trying to figure out what's going on. And individually, even if you're in an organization, you're wondering, do I really want to go through this? This is going to be a lot of work.
Yeah.
And so that's when it became very clear that this power of vision had been really misunderstood. And that was the driving force of sustainable change, as were the quality of relationships that I call resonant relationships, where you're in tune.
Mm-hmm.
And those were the effective leaders. So every time we did a study of people in leadership positions, we would find the top 5 to 7% were accounting for almost all of the performance or innovation.
Mm-hmm.
78% of the people weren't adding any value. They could be taken out of that role, in the leadership role, and the organization would do better. And as we zeroed in on that, the quality of it, it became clear, for example, as I say in the book, uh, leadership is a relationship. It's not a person. Nobody is a leader by themselves. You have to have followers. It's kind of a definition. And just
Right.
because people report to you, it doesn't mean they're not spitting in your coffee as they bring it to you. So
Yeah.
the question is, what's the nature of the leader and followers relationship? And that's where I leaned again on the psychophysiology and the medicine to say that it has to be qualities of the relationship that open you up, that are the
Yeah.
antidote to stress.
Yeah.
Because
This
if they,
resonant leadership
that's
idea.
right.
As you were talking and you were saying this concept of opening, basically opening people's mind up to be more capable in those moments to visualize change and to see possibilities and futures that they had not thought about, and
And to notice
to,
things going on in the present that you'd miss otherwise. Yeah.
yeah, and in a sense cognitively invest in those things, perhaps. uh
Sorry, Tom, let's be a little more careful here because we can do this now. It's
sure.
not just cognitively. It's actually the more powerful is emotionally, because our
Sure.
emotions are
Yeah.
activated before a thought,
Yeah. Right.
even neurologically. But it's absolutely fascinating that the key is, of course, to have a thought,
Hmm.
but the thought is not, I mean, in the human brain, you can't really separate cognitive and affective or
Hmm.
thinking and emotion because they
Right.
happen at the same time. But the importance is, I remember a mentor of mine sadly passed away just a few years ago. Ed Hollander wrote, a professor at Baruch in New York, had written about this in the 50s, in which he talked about the fact that when we follow a leader, we often give them idiosyncrasy credits. Decades later, I was talking to Ed about the fact that I thought the basis of the idiosyncrasy credits was this unconscious emotional being onto or being afraid of a leader.
Hmm.
And today, in almost every political context, there are very few people who actually vote for someone. They almost always vote against the other person. So and when the two people appear very similar, to say what's the difference? It's some unconscious emotional reaction
Hmm.
that results in the person consciously saying, I'll forgive this person that transgression. I'm not going to forgive that person.
Yeah. Yeah. I I was
Sorry, I
I
interrupted
was
your
sure.
thought.
No, no. No, my thought was with regard to change and thinking about, the data that people throw around, numbers like 70% of all change initiatives fail, and that sort of thing. But I was thinking about this concept that if you can open people up emotionally
Right.
and cognitively to
Yep.
potential opportunities, then they begin to see the positive. And you were saying basically that there's the negative and the positive. And I was thinking of it in the sense that most of the work that's been done on change, essentially, with the reason a lot of people are resistant to change is, in a sense, some sort of fear of
Yep.
difference or whatever it may be. And so what you're describing is to move away from the fear and move to
Yeah.
an openness, a
Look,
receptiveness. And if you can do that, then
yeah,
change becomes so much more possible.
yeah, more sustainable. See, the key is, look, it's natural that we worry about the fear because the default for the human organism is to defend itself,
Mm-hmm.
individually or collectively. The problem is when are what keeps you up at night when you're a manager or a leader is the person who's a pain in the ass or the person or the problem you have with some product line. Um, and you start to focus on that. When you begin to dwell on that, your context for what you're doing the next day is worrying about that problem. Now
Mm-hmm.
you are stuck in what I call the negative emotional attractor. Everything you do is going to pull you to that problem. You are not open, as you just reviewed quite well, accurately, to the possibilities. So while we do have to solve problems and specific goals are very useful later in the change process because it helps you focus. But as soon
Mm-hmm.
as you focus, as one set of studies showed, your peripheral vision goes from 180 to 30 degrees. You miss everything out there. And in strategy, it's called competition neglect. But there's all sorts of things. You can miss things about what's going on in your organizational climate. You can miss things that are going on with your market, your competitors. I mean, look, if people weren't missing these things, if leaders weren't missing these things, we wouldn't have current motivation crisis. Why do I say that? 80% of the people that have full-time jobs across the industrialized world are not engaged in their work.
Right.
So their bodies are showing up, but not their creative minds. That's why we have so much trouble with innovation and why we look to people that are serial innovators with such awe because a lot of people have the ability to do that, but we're in environments that keep pushing us into this narrow, more defensive mode. So you're right. The challenge is how do we learn individually as well as otherwise to step outside of that? Now, one of the dilemmas is that when you're in a leadership position, whether it's head of a company or head of a project team or a parent in a family, you have more power in the system,
Mm-hmm.
which means the emotional contagion suggests that you're more contagious, you're more infectious than the others. Now, when that works positively is when we see the magic. When it works negatively is when we see the curtailing. I mean, a couple of my executive doctoral students in their 50s had done this analysis for one of my classes on what really was going on in Kodak in their culture in the 90s. Now, I happen to
Mm-hmm.
know because I knew most of the presidents and worked with them in the 80s through to about the late 80s. And they were saying that at Kodak, throughout all the divisions, they were preoccupied with Fuji because Fuji had this
Mm-hmm.
brilliant color 35 millimeter film. And their preoccupation led to a defensive posture, and Kodak is gone. It's bankrupt,
Yeah.
which was amazing since they had the patents
Right.
on digital photography in 1974. So you stop and say, and I mean, it's not like they weren't open to it. They owned it
Yeah.
and they let it go. And we could see those stories, Borders, Blockbuster, Sears. I mean, Sears
Yeah.
was in the mail order business 150 years before Amazon existed.
Right. They were Amazon before Amazon.
Right. Why did they go bankrupt? And you keep seeing this thing where um, when people in leadership take a very narrow focus, and one of the dilemmas is if you exclusively focus on the financials. Look, I don't have any problem with money. I've built and run two companies. I enjoy investing as a hobby, and I seem to do well at it. So, it's not it's an arena that I like. So I'm not saying this because I'm talking something about money, but I'm saying when the preoccupation is on the financial measures, you're moving yourself into a network in the brain which is very narrow.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, you actually are blocking out. It's literally tunnel vision.
Hmm.
And what does it say to the people that are sitting around, even in the C-suite, if all you do is talk about the impact on the numbers? It says, well, I'm merely an instrument to these numbers.
Yeah.
And, that's not very motivating.
Could
Even
you?
if you have a lot of stock options,
Yeah.
it's motivating for 1 to 1.5 years, and then it loses its drive power.
Yeah. Would would you could you describe that almost as dissonant? I don't like to say it's leadership, but dissonant
Yes.
leadership in a
Yeah.
sense, because
Yeah.
it's the opposite of this concept that
Yeah. It,
you've
well,
created of
think
resonant leadership, I
think
think.
about resonant dissonant as, are you in sync with the people around you, or are you
Hmm.
dancing to the beat of a different drummer?
Yeah.
And that's the part that ends up being, once people emotionally disengage, you lose their ability to innovate. Well, without innovation, you don't get change. And without change, you atrophy. And you and I both know a lot of organizations that, because of their insistence on focusing on a narrow measure or a narrow definition of what they do in their strategy, they get a form of organizational arterial sclerosis.
Hmm.
They literally harm their whole system. Well, for innovation to occur, you have to have diversity of thought. Now, diversity of thought is helped when you have a diversity of people,
Hmm.
but it's not enough because they have to talk to each other. So just
Right.
having people of different genders and Myers-Briggs types sitting around a room, or different faiths, etc., races, etc., does not say that they'll listen to each other. So diversity is imperative for innovation, but it's diversity with dialogue. So now we come to, the dialogue means you have to feel as if you're in tune with each other. And the thing that we started measuring, I came out of a sabbatical in 2006 at London Business School with this insight that our relationships are the agar agar of the petri dish of life. And every individual characteristic we have, traits, competencies, values, anything, get mediated or transformed through our climate, our culture.
Hmm.
Same thing in families. And that leads to the output. So I started, and because I'd done a lot of work with organizational climate in the 70s, I started, looked at that stuff. I said, that was focusing on everything. And I chose to develop a measure that would focus on three characteristics that opened people up physiologically. And if it did individually, then the emotional contagion would mean it could in teams or even in communities. And that's when I started to figure out what those pieces were. And we now have over 50 studies, about two-thirds have been published, showing that it described this resonant leadership relationship where you're in tune with each other. It has three dramatic characteristics. One, people share a sense of vision. They share a sense of purpose and meaning, not just
Hmm.
goals. Those goals are narrow, but it's the bigger picture that they share. Why are we doing this?
Yeah.
I mean, the president of one of the largest investment banks, I used to do a 3 hour leadership development session in the middle part of a 6 month program they had for their top directors. And he would come in to introduce me, but he'd, throw in a few of his ideas. And I remember him saying to all these people at this huge investment banking company, what's our purpose? And somebody would say, to make money. He said, no. Well, what's our purpose? Help our clients make money? No. What's our purpose? He kept going until somebody said something, and he said, it's freedom. Our purpose is freedom of choice. We exist to help our clients, individuals, families, organizations, or sovereign funds, increase their freedom of choice. Now, making money is the measure of how well we're doing. So, it's important, but it's
Hmm.
the measure, not the purpose. And that's the example about the vision, the shared vision. The second characteristic is shared compassion. Now, a lot of people say, oh my God, you're going to turn us all into therapists or social workers. I'm not talking about asking people about their relationship to their mothers. I'm talking about the fact that you care about each other.
Right.
And when people feel that they are merely an instrument for you doing better, they're going to feel used and they'll cut back their discretionary effort, in the words of Dan Yankolovich. So, this caring, and I've done this even with in the military, it's very
Mm-hmm.
clear this is powerful. And
Mm-hmm.
having worked with SEAL teams and instructors of Delta Force and even interviewed SAS members, I can assure you that in the elite teams, and some of my current executive doctoral students are actually, one did 14 tours as a special operator. And they said, yeah, I mean, your mission is what you're working on, but what keeps you together, the emotional glue, is you're caring for each other.
Mm-hmm.
The third characteristic is where you have a shared sense of energy. And here the example I'll use is anybody who has a partner or a spouse knows that if one likes to go out dancing and going out at the clubs and the other likes sitting at home with a book, you've got a recipe for an awful lot of arguments. Shared vision, compassion, energy. And it turns out there are a few other things that we've noticed about them,
Mm-hmm.
that very often in these in tune relationships that I call resonant, there's a degree of playfulness. And the playfulness is important because, again, you don't get innovation without a quest for novelty.
Yeah.
Now, you introduced the word dissonant. So, dissonant is when you're disjointed. Well, dissonant can happen because somebody's annoying or
Mm-hmm.
somebody's negative or somebody's always talking about fear. And I used to watch a lot of top executives because I worked with many CEOs of Fortune 100 companies. And the ones that opened their meetings with financials would almost always be less effective
Yeah.
than the others. And the ones that opened with a current problem, and one of the ones that was the most resonant I've ever seen of grew one hospital to 16 hospitals setting company. He'd have the heads of each unit, the hospitals or outpatient clinic, come in for a 60-minute meeting in his office once a week. And at the end, as they're leaving, he'd pick out two of them randomly and he'd say, can you bring an example of a patient that was helped in your facility during this coming
Mm-hmm.
week to our meeting next week? So the next week, they'd all get there, get around the table, and he'd open up with those two people. This is Tom Strauss, formerly a CEO of Summa Health Systems. This guy's brilliant. What he knew was that to sacrifice 5, maybe 8 minutes of his 60 minutes to these two stories kept everybody in the room reminded that they weren't there to make budget. They
Yeah.
were there to heal
Purpose.
people.
Yeah.
And they were good at it. So then when they talked about the budget variances, they had a more open mind. And the other category of leader that I think it's very important to look at are demagogues. Now,
Mm-hmm.
these are people who seem resonant to a small group, to an in group. They're
Yeah.
cocooned, but they're dissonant to the outside group. I mean, one example I could use is Bobby Knight. I mean, people who
Mm-hmm.
played for him loved him, but compared to Coach K or John Wooten,
Yeah.
not that many became pros and not that many became coaches at major programs.
I'm reminded of this story of Namusa Zakali.
Yes,
And I was wondering if you could share that story for
sure.
our listeners
This
because I think it really crystallizes even more this idea of resonant leadership and change. Great
Namusa
story. I,
Zakali is a teacher in the Republic of South Africa. Her husband was also a teacher, and he was invited to be the principal, or they call in those systems the head teacher of the high school in this one region of KwaZulu Natal. And 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 she was going to be with him. So the Ministry of Education asked her if she would open a new elementary school evenly between three Zulu villages. Now in South Africa, the Zulu area is probably the most economically depressed of the whole of South Africa. So they gave her a salary and they assigned 70 elementary school children from these three Zulu villages to her and four trees. And they said, "There are your classrooms." So she quickly thought about it, got in touch with the elders in the villages, and got in touch with the parents of the elementary school students that she was going to have there. And she asked them to all come over. And they immediately started clearing the area around the four trees and actually putting up some fences to at least keep out the bigger animals. Because this is, kind of raw parts of Africa. And we had a chance, my wife and I had a chance to meet her a few years after that. Literally, it was about 4 years after that. And we were blown away because one of the first things she did is she realized she was not going to be able to get any more teachers. Because South Africa said, unless you have a concrete classroom, you can't get another teacher's salary. And they had straw and twig built classrooms, and then they had the trees.
Mm-hmm.
And it was amazing to watch the children. I mean, unlike almost anything we see in our country, they were all sitting there leaning in, trying to get it and, really working at it. Well, she immediately went to the local safari company. She got placed on the tour where they would go to them at the health clinics and some of the other
Mm-hmm.
things. That meant that people like us got really enthralled, intrigued, and began donating.
Yeah.
She wrote to the CEO of every large company in South Africa and said, "We're a very small elementary school. We don't have resources. Anything you can give would be appreciated." Well, I mean, a few gave money, but one sent a truck of desks and chairs because they had changed their decor. One
Yeah.
sent a truck, I don't know why, but a truck of paper they were no longer using. So things like that started to happen. And all of a sudden, I remember walking into what was her office, but it was the main resource room, and that was the room where they had two or three computers at that point, 2002. And I looked up on the wall, and there's a flip chart thing that says vision. And so what she would do is at the beginning of every year, she would have all of the parents of the children who were going to be coming to the school come together with any of the teachers or aides that they had, because they had a certain number of aides that were volunteers. And they would sit in a room together and they would start the day's discussion by saying, what's our vision for the Como school and what our children are going to experience during this next year? And they would literally create the vision. Now,
Mm-hmm.
often has similar parts to it, but they would feel it again.
Mm-hmm.
And then as the system grew, she would have the parents talk about every one of the classes, and they would all volunteer, not just to be chaperones, but actually to help in the teaching. By the time she retired a few years ago, they had 1,000 students, and
Incredible.
they had 23 concrete classrooms, 23 actual teachers. She even had created an AIDS program for 70 of the AIDS orphans in their communities and used the donations to, in a sense, informally foster them in families in the community so she could help pay the money and set up some support. But she was brilliant because she was also Zulu.
Yeah.
And she knew that, among other things, Zulu traditions included singing and dancing. So every morning, all of the children would get together from, what we would think of as kindergarten to sixth
Mm-hmm.
grade,
Mm-hmm.
and they would get together and they would open the day doing some songs and dances. And throughout the day, they would move up, around the different classrooms. And she used this infectious smile and sense of humor amazingly. Talk about positive contagion.
Yeah.
But she was also no nonsense. I mean, a number of years later, in
Sure.
2007, we're standing there talking to her out in front of one of the rooms not far from the parking lot, and one of the children was running from one part of the school to another, and there was a candy wrapper, not from the child, but there was a candy wrapper on the ground, and she did just a motion with her hand and then just looked. She didn't even point at the candy wrapper, and the kid skidded to a stop, went back, picked it up, and took and ran. She was a resident leader, and
Hmm.
as I wrote about her in my as a case of resident leadership in my 2005 book, some movie documentary people picked it up and they did a documentary on her called Under Four Trees. And as a result of that, they were able to bring her to San Francisco. Sadly, my wife and I were in Europe at the time. We couldn't go, but it was the first time outside of South Africa, never left the United States. And she had a fantastic time, but she was able to garner the recognition. And all of it was because she linked the children and the parents and the teachers and the staff together.
Hmm.
This, we're in this together thing.
Yeah.
It's what we see in the United States these days in the better charter schools.
Hmm.
What we have seen occasionally in some of the parochial schools. And then what we
Yeah.
see in those public school systems that are known for involving parents.
Hmm.
Um, but
Yeah.
it's a marvelous positive story.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. It's inspiring, and it is extraordinarily informative, and it clearly demonstrates these concepts that you're
Yeah,
describing in a wonderful
The-
way.
these are ultimately practical things. I mean, because they're actually so simple if you think about it. What's more human than talking to each other? Now,
Right.
what gets in the way today of talking to each other? We're too busy. We're doing all sorts of things on email, and that's like saying Facebook friends aren't really friends. Come on.
Right.
And, yes, you and I are able to do this,
Yeah.
electronically, and your audience will be able to listen to the podcast. But we're doing it with a specific time limited focus.
Yeah.
This is not a good way to build a relationship if we were trying to work together over time, which means you're going to work together over a lot of ups and downs.
Right.
So the key to these factors I'm talking about, of vision, of caring, of these resonant relationships, is that they enable the sustainability of your sense of purpose moving ahead. And as you said earlier, your openness to noticing new ideas and possibilities.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a pretty good segue to the next thing I was wanting to ask. We've talked about change and how it relates to leadership. You've gone through the science of how change works, and this idea of practicality, I think, is one that I definitely try to do here on the science of leadership. So, if you were to put together, what are some concrete steps that we as leaders can
Sure.
take to navigate change ourselves, as well as foster in those we lead that resilience and adaptability needed for success?
When I was doing a lot of work with the Navy and Marine Corps leadership and against performance and looking at what really makes a difference, and which included sometimes serving on an FFG for a week or um, on bases, it was amazing that the most effective military um, senior enlisted and officers, all the way on up to three-star admirals and three-star generals, when you actually got them when you watched them, or you got them to tell critical incidents that occurred and cross tabulated that against others' reports of the same events, they don't use command and control. In their
Exactly.
words, it's ask and inspire. So,
Hmm.
first, practical issue. Spend time with the people that report to you, and then with the people that report to them, and then with the people that report to them, talking about your purpose, the meaning.
Hmm.
Why does your organization exist? Where does it fit into the whole thing about society? And in a sense, what we're talking about is the big picture. And yes, it's fuzzy, but
Mm-hmm.
honestly, that's what moves us.
Yeah.
So, talking about the vision, the purpose, the meaning of the work is really important. Now, do you have to spend a lot of time on it? No, because I'd say, if you spend more than 10, 15 minutes on it, it's going to get boring. So, what you want to do is make sure you open every meeting with a few minutes around vision. Now, what do you
Mm-hmm.
do in those few minutes? You could tell a story of a customer or client that was served exceedingly well. You can highlight somebody who did an amazing innovation. You can talk about the shared values. You can ask people questions to get them to offer because it can't just be one way. It has to be back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
But you want to raise the issue of the vision through a variety of techniques. You don't want to use the same technique each time because if you
Mm-hmm.
keep talking about the shared values, after the fourth time it gets a little boring. But the idea is open the meetings reminding people of the purpose. Then
Yeah.
they're in a more open mind, literally, to be able to look at the variances and the budget issues and all the rest of it. Second, appreciate the fact that leadership is about relationships with
Yeah.
people. It's not about leading a strategic plan. As a matter of fact, I don't even think organizations change because of strategic plans. I think strategic plans are useful to get the bank to know that you're eligible for borrowing money and for resource allocations. But very few people are ever motivated to change because of a strategic plan because it's very analytic.
Mm-hmm.
They're motivated by emotional swarms. And you see that when people get excited about a new product or a new process or
Yeah.
a way of serving people. So the idea is, how do you help foster positive emotional contagion? Well, keep the contagion around the purpose
Mm-hmm.
or keep it around um, each other, in a sense. In the last chapter of our 2019 book, Helping People Change, we talked about, or the chapter before the last chapter, we talked about the importance of organizations developing a culture of development to
Mm-hmm.
complement the culture of performance, not to replace it. Of course, you need a culture of performance. Without that, you don't exist. But too many organizations think that that's their only purpose. It's not. And the evidence that the culture of development is missing are these lousy engagement numbers. Now, when
Right.
you activate these parallel, and we now know you can't do them at the same time, neurologically and hormonally, the systems that enable you to do one and the other are antagonistic in the body.
Hmm.
So as soon as you activate one, you suppress the other. So what you need is to be able to develop both. Is it possible? Yes. Just a positive example, MD Anderson, the number one cancer
Yeah.
hospital in the US. They are phenomenal. They've created a process of development for everybody who works in that organization, from janitorial staff all the way up to, heads of major institutes and Nobel Prize winners. It's an amazing place. And their engagement numbers are running 91%. Yeah, it's
Tremendous.
mind-boggling. They're still number one in cancer diagnosis and
Yeah.
treatment and research to help um, find new ways, new medicines, and new techniques and all that. So it's not like there's anything slipping with the performance, but they're able to do this. Now, I've seen other organizations do that. Very often, it's not the whole organization. That's the one place where I think MD Anderson is unique, or relatively different. Most of the time, it's a division, or it's a business unit, or it's a product line within an organization, or a department within a government agency. So the idea is, if we can foster a sense of development that parallels, people feel like they'll grow. I mean, a survey was done of 1,800 MBA graduates in Europe, I don't know, about 15 years ago. It was before the 2008 recession. And it was done 2 years after they graduated. And MBA graduates everywhere in the world are notorious for changing jobs.
Hmm.
So they asked them, why did you go to work for the company you're now working for 2 years after they graduated? And why are you going to stay? Salary and benefits was the seventh item listed on the ranking. The top six were opportunities to grow, opportunities to develop, opportunities to do new things. So it was all
Hmm.
novelty and development. And
Yeah.
I think that that's what really excites people. And if you want people to be open to noticing new opportunities, new ways to serve your customers or create new processes, as we used to say, to be able to go to the moon and come back safely, it's going to be something that requires a lot more of this sense of development. And it's not just for some of those, you know, I mean, I have examples in the book. I don't know if you got to those latter chapters yet, but of how certain mayors of certain cities have been able to reduce the degree of homelessness, whereas in other comparable cities, and we see it again played out in teams all the time, whether they're teams that make it to the summit of Everest or like Alexander Klimchuk's Krubera team go to the lowest caves in the earth. Here's the ultimate practical aspect of it. It all starts with you. So if you, in the position of a leader, a manager, a coach, a parent, if you
Hmm.
don't feel excited about what you're doing, if you don't feel a sense of literally inspiration, it's you're not going to emotionally share that with others. And this emotional contagion happens unconsciously. So it happens in thousandths of a second, way below consciousness. So the first thing I'd say is people have to think about, why am I doing what I'm doing?
Yeah.
Am I caring for the people that are important to me? Is my life something that, well, if I don't have a perfect life now, do I at least feel like I'm moving toward it in some small ways?
Hmm.
That if you have that, then what happens is other people catch it. And little by little, as I like to say, when you activate what I call this positive emotional attractor in yourself, people around you starts to radiate out. And you begin to find in your families, as well as in your communities or in your work organizations, people doing things together that you never thought were possible.
Yeah. That's when great things happen, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's this sense of, as you were speaking, I was thinking it's a positive attitude. And I don't mean attitude in the sense of what we typically would say affectively
Right.
attitude, but I mean bearing. I'm heading toward the positive,
Right.
and that, as you say, is contagious. There are these ripple
Yeah.
effects, and it impacts what we do, what others do with us, and
How
beyond.
everybody else feels. And my theory, as well as all the research, shows that you can't do that exclusively. I mean, if you always focused on the positive, you'd levitate. Yeah, and you
Sure.
wouldn't care about any of these things. So, but the idea is to try to, in every day where there are all these forces that pull us into a defensive mode that are necessary, to have techniques, interpersonal techniques, personal practices that enable you to reverse this kind of hormonal surge in your body. And that's really, I mean, we showed this in a series of published studies a few years ago that having more of these 10 to 15-minute episodes during any given day and during a week are more important than big chunks of time.
Yeah. Well, I think I think that'd be a great place for us to end out. Dr. Boyatzis, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. Tremendous amount that you've shared, and it's been superb. I think the science of change through this lens of resonant leadership is something that every leader, myself included, needs to grasp. And so, listeners, if you want to dive deeper, be sure to check out Dr. Boyatzis' soon to be released book, The Science of Change. Sir, thank you for joining us on this episode. It's really been excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.